Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Boscombe Down Branch evening lecture on today, the 16th of November. Welcome to everybody. This is going to be our second lecture in what we've called Mosquito Month, really sort of reflecting a little bit back to 80 years ago when the Mosquito entered RAF service. And tonight's lecture is going to be about returning a UK-built Mosquito to our skies. Some of you may recall quite some years ago now, we had a talk about flying the UK Mosquito that was owned at one stage, I think, by Rolls-Royce. We are working on the branch calendar, should be there very shortly now. If you and we will be announcing that probably in the next couple of weeks for those who would like a copy of that in time for sending out as Christmas gifts or for yourself. The price will be much the same as last year, and it will be featuring the wide range of kinetic aviation activities and the various aircraft that Kinetic operates, including target systems. So without more ado, let's introduce our speakers. So David Smith, I haven't been, I'm sure he will explain what the aircraft is, whether it's a Spitfire or something else he's sitting in, but he spent 23 years with Airbus, variety of commercial and business management roles. He's a specialist in complex commercial transactions, obviously why he's been brought onto this project. And he recently retired after 9 years working with the UK Department of Transport and a senior commercial role in DVSA. And he is actually a frustrated engineer, he says, and interested in anything with an engine, especially motorcycles and aircrafts. And then also giving the lecture tonight is Alan Pickford. And he's recently retired after working with ExxonMobil. For most of the time he's involved in cost and schedule estimates. His love of the Mosquito stems from growing up next to where the last Mosquito operated from the UK, and the fact that his uncle flew 48 missions to Germany as a Mosquito navigator in World War II, and all of us who've read anything, I think, about aviation missions into Germany will know what a risky endeavour that was. So without more ado, we'll be swapping over to their slides, and we look forward to hearing their talk.
Good evening, everyone. My name's David Smith. I'm here tonight with my colleague Alan Pickford. We both are volunteers, directors and trustees of the Peoples Mosquito charity. The way we've structured this tonight is that we've got a short presentation. I'll be giving you a reminder about the Mosquito, its development, a little bit about how it was made, so it gives you an idea of the challenges we face as a charity today. And then Alan will take over and talk about the charity itself, the project, and I'm sure I hope you'll all be interested in the current status of where we've got to. So that's how we're going to structure tonight. Alan is driving the slides, so forgive me when I say next slide, please, Alan, when I'm ready to go to the next slide. But I'd like to start by thanking you very, very much for the opportunity to talk to you. As my intro said, I'm a commercial man. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a historian, so please forgive me if I get anything wrong. When I retired, I desperately realized I desperately wanted to get back involved with aircraft, and working for this charity is scratching that particular itch. My role's director of fundraising. They call me head of begging. I'll rattle the virtual tin tonight. If you look us up on social media website, you'll see how you can help us, and any help and support you can give will be much appreciated. I won't say any more than that. Alan, Director of Finance, I beg, he spends, and between the two of us, you've got quite a range of skills. So let's start with a brief history of the Mosquito. Next slide, please, Alan. What we have here is a quotation you'll see if you look at any sort of history or material on the DH.98 Mosquito. It's a quotation from a letter Geoffrey de Havilland wrote to the Air Ministry in September 1939. And I think it's worth commenting that his company with the Comet Racer, with the Albatross, was uniquely positioned to take the concept of an unarmed, fast bomber into reality. It gives you the impression it was his idea, and a few interesting facts might come out tonight, but actually The idea first surfaced in a note to the Air Ministry by a Handley Page employee in May 1937, a gentleman called G.R. Volkert. But this was sort of bouncing around the ministry. March 1938, the Air Ministry put a consideration paper out about the concept. But let's give thanks to Geoffrey de Havilland for being in a position with his company to take the concept forward. In October 1939, the design team from Hatfield moved to Salisbury Hall near Hatfield, which is where the de Havilland Museum is now. January 1940, a specification came from the Air Ministry, and it included a very important requirement. And I think it's worth quoting that word for word. It said the aircraft had to be of wooden or composite construction, employing materials and classes of labour which are not used to any great extent at present on standard aircraft for the RAF. So you can see with the Comet Racer, with the Albatross, the wooden construction, everything with that requirement sort of played right into Geoffrey de Havilland's hands. So it was a mostly wood construction, and it enabled skills, and this is important, not used in the aviation industry at the time, people like coach builders and cabinet makers, to get involved and help the war effort. So if we go to the next slide, please, Alan. There we have the prototype de Havilland 98 Mosquito in the de Havilland Museum today. There was a picture taken, I think, by Alan himself. As it says there, it first flew in November 1940. Now that's incredible, because if you think back, the requirement didn't come out till late 39. So as an ex-commercial man, I would have been delighted if some of our programs had gone 11 months from drawing board to first flight. It was an incredible achievement. And what I find interesting is that although the aircraft went through something like 40 different marks and variants, the structure remained essentially the same. So it was a very strong structure, and it proved that it was high performance. Orders were increased up to 200 after the demonstration in December 1940 to Lord Beaverbrook, and it then moved to trials at somewhere called the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment. I wonder where that is. I think you might know something about that. Next aircraft, W4051, flew in June 1941, and it was delivered in July 1941 to a photo reconnaissance unit at Benson. So that's when it first started to go into service. Now, I think it's also worth mentioning during this period, a gentleman called Wilfred Freeman was a great friend of the project, and it was known as Freeman's Folly because there are a lot of people who didn't believe a wooden aircraft would be, an unarmed wooden aircraft would be the way forward. And he actually saved the project on more than one occasion. Now, if you want to find out more about what was happening in that period, I don't know if you can see this. This is a particularly good book called The Wooden Wonder, written by a gentleman called Edward Bishop in the 1950s. Now, when he wrote it, he had access to a lot of the people who were players in the story at the time, and it's of its era, and it's a fascinating read. The other book I found interesting was Wilfred Freeman. It was all about him and what he did during the Second World War, and again, it's another book, if you want to get into more detail of that era, that period, well worth a read, and contact us afterwards if you want to find out more what the title of those books are. So if we move to the next slide, we'll answer the question, where was it made? Now, there was a huge expansion of production, and there was something like 400 subcontractors involved at the peak of production, including furniture makers like Parker Knoll, piano makers, small engineering companies, and even it said that there were housewives making simple components in their garden sheds. And there's some 10,000 drawings involved, so it wasn't a simple aircraft to make. Now, the main production sites you can see listed there on the slides. There were 6 in the UK, including a couple of motor companies, or one motor company and a couple of other aircraft companies. Interestingly, the last one was made at what is now the Airbus Broughton site up near Chester, and the last one came off the production line there in November 1950. Now, as I say to people, it's a potential for us to have our aircraft flying to celebrate in 2025, to celebrate that anniversary. We need more help and support, but that is a stretch target for us. So it was made in Canada and Australia as well, and I'll tell you a little bit about some that were made in Canada later on. So it was this is what it was, a huge supply chain. I think the point I'm trying to make is, and all these components coming together to build the aircraft. Interesting fact, 7,781 were made, and that compares to, where are my notes, something like 20,000 Spitfires, 14,000 Hurricanes, and 7,000, just over 7,000 Lancasters made in the same period. That's an awful lot of Merlin engines. Next slide, please, Alan. Okay, I'm going to focus a little bit about how it was made now, and what you've got here are some pictures that show you how the wing was made as a single construction, a single piece with 2 very long tip-to-tip spars, something like 16 ribs in between. And when the wing was assembled, you can see there the engines were assembled at that stage and put onto engine mountings on the leading edge of the wing. You can just see the radiators there in that top left picture as well. In the bottom left, you can see some ladies making I think it's the false trailing edge in a more conventional style. But yeah, the main construction of the wing was wooden spars, wooden ribs. And if you can see it, I don't know if it's coming out very clearly, there's a works instruction on the factory wall, which makes me smile. Whatever you do, don't spare the glue. Now, I think you probably all know that the initial glue used was something called Kaysan, which is a milk-based glue, and that was later replaced in 1942 with a synthetic resin glue. Now, when I did this talk to the materials people, we went into a lot more detail about glues, and it's a long chain polymer. Kaysan is technically a metal. And you can make it yourself at home if you have the inclination. So that's how the wing was made. If we go to the next slide, and I'll take a bit more time over this one, you can see, and this is relevant to what Alan's going to share later, you can see how the fuselage was made. Now, it was basically a balsa plywood balsa sandwich formed over a mould, and you can see the moulds there in the pictures, and the balsa ply sandwich was pulled down over the mould with those metal straps. You can see the chaps on the right there, with the straps alongside them. And the fuselage was made in 2 halves, 2 shells, on sort of matching molds, if you can follow me, so that you had 2 eggshell type shells that came together to form the fuselage itself. Now, next slide, please, Alan. Before you bring those 2 halves together, you have the wonderful ability to start putting equipment in, and you can see the picture on the right. You can see the ladies putting into the fuselage halves sort of control runs, hydraulics, oxygen bottles, etc. You can also very clearly see the bulkheads in the mold, in the fuselage halves there, which some of this stuff was attached to. Interesting point, the plywood was wound spirally towards the end of the fuselage, the tail end of the fuselage, and that was to give it increased strength. And you can just about see that in the photographs, I think. Yeah, port side was control cable runs, starboard side was hydraulics. Now, it's a joke, but it is just like a model aeroplane kit. That's how it was made. So if we move on to the next slide, what you see there is a completed fuselage section, and it's being, there's the very proud employees of the subcontractor that made it sat in front of it, or stood in front of it as well. And the sketch in there, you can see how the fuselage itself comes down onto the completed wing structure to form basically the airframe. And that's how it was assembled and started to form the airframe itself. Now, if we move to the next picture, please, Alan. Thank you. You should be able to see a cutaway drawing of the Mosquito that shows you just the extent of the wooden material in the airframe. There's very little metal. There's the undercarriage, there's the engine mounts, there's a few cast components for the tail wheel. And I think, again, from memory, there's only, other than the engines, I think there's only something like 120 kilograms of metal in the airframe structure itself. So again, the aircraft, it was called the Wooden Wonder, and you can see why there. The wings, tailplane and fin were covered in, and I can never pronounce this, Madalpalam fabric, and that was doped and painted as other aircraft were at the time. Very little metal. Interesting fact, there were 6 woods used in the construction of the Mosquito. If this was a live talk, I'd be going around the room asking you to put your hands up to tell me which ones they were, but I'll tell you. There was birch, spruce, balsa, ash, Douglas fir and walnut. Now, interesting fact again, the balsa came from South America. And as you can imagine, during the period when this was in full production, there were people trying to stop things coming across the Atlantic into the UK. So there was some work done at looking at an alternative to balsa using seaweed, ironically by a refugee German scientist. And he got it to the point where the seaweed derived material was deemed fit for use by de Havilland, but by the time they'd reached that point, the supply issues had gone away, and I forget which museum. I think it's a Manchester museum. There are some of the test pieces still on display there, and we've got a lovely article on that in one of our club magazines. In the back issues, if you want to join us and look back to read out more about that, and that little interesting fact did get the materials people, when I talked to them, quite excited. So if we move to the next slide, Alan. A little bit about the armament. It was an incredibly versatile aircraft. As I say, there was something like 40 different marks made: fighter, fighter bomber, photo reconnaissance, trainer. What we're looking at here is the armament on the left of the fighter bomber Mark 6, which is the mark our aircraft will be in, and the fighter bomber Mark 18, what was called the Tetsi. Now, what you've got there in the fighter bomber is 4 303 Brownings, 4 20mm Hispano cannons, and with that it could carry 2 500-pound bombs. Later on, they could put 2 on the wings as well. In the bomber version, it could carry 4 500-pound bombs or 1 4,000-pound bomb. Now, the Mark 18 you see is fascinating, and it was used for submarine hunting. They replaced the cannon in the nose with a Moulds 6-pound anti-tank gun, which was modified from a 57mm artillery piece. And you can see the gentleman carrying one of the shells posing in front of the nose of the aircraft. And we've got one on our stand we take to air shows. They're quite weighty shells. And I think off the top of my head, there was something like 22 of these carried, and the mechanism to load them into the gun was made by actually a cigarette vending machine manufacturer. Yeah, the aircraft, I think, momentarily stalled at the time you pressed the button. And one of our veterans has flown a Mark 18, and he's got some interesting stories to tell us about the flying characteristics with that thing up front. So that's a little bit about the armament, and I apologise for this being so broad. There's so much we could talk about, so I'm trying to give you a sort of a broad appreciation of the aircraft and what it did, rather than going into too much detail on any one aspect. So we move to the next slide, and this was very nerve-wracking for me, because I did a talk to the Rolls-Royce Heritage Trust, and they sent me material on engines they wanted presenting. So I was presenting someone else's material to a audience of experts, talking about their own subject. It's a little bit like tonight. You know, I'm very conscious you're all very knowledgeable people, and I'm a mere amateur by comparison. Yeah. It was the Merlin engine. It was there were various marks used. There were 8 different Rolls-Royce Merlin engine marks dedicated to the Mosquito. Some of them were for altitude performance capabilities, and I've got another chart which I won't show you tonight that shows which ones those are. And there were 3 Packard US-built Merlin engine marks dedicated to the Mosquito. Now, what we want are Rolls-Royce Mark 25 or Rolls-Royce Packard Merlin 225s for our fighter bomber Mark 6. It always comes up when we give talks. The engines both rotated in the same direction. It wasn't until they got to the, I've forgotten the aircraft type now, Hornet, that they tried contra-rotating propellers. But both engines going in the same direction did make the takeoff interesting. And there's another book which I thoroughly recommend by Bill Sweetman, where he says it was a slightly nervous thoroughbred which could perform impressive feats in the hands of the courageous and competent, but it would occasionally deal out a kick or a bite. Now, I do recommend Bill Sweetman's books. There are some wonderful illustrations in there as well. So that's a little bit about engines. If we could move on, Alan, please. Interesting facts again. The Mosquito served with many different air forces. The Israeli Air Force used ex-French fighter bomber Mark 6s in the Suez crisis, and that's the configuration, the scheme you see in the aircraft in the top. And the nationalistic Chinese Air Force bought a number of Mosquito fighter bomber 25s and, can't read it, T3s, I think that says, from Canada during the late 1940s. So if you want to impress people with your Mosquito knowledge, you can say, did you know the Chinese operated them? Did you know the Israelis operated them? Now, post-World War II in the UK, the Mosquitoes tended to be used for high altitude photo reconnaissance and metrology with the RAF. And interesting fact, last combat sortie was on the 15th of December, 1955, with a photo reconnaissance Mark 34A looking at communist strongholds in the Malaysian jungle. So there we are. I hope that's interesting for you. If we can move on to the next slide, and I'm getting close to the end of my part of the talk. What we see there is a flypast of the last Mosquito unit in the UK. Has special significance for Alan, because Alan being a Devon man, this was they were based at Exeter. They were converted. There were 140 B-35s converted to target tugs by Brooklands Aviation. They were used by the civilian anti-aircraft cooperation units in the 50s and early 60s. They towed target drones for gunnery practice, and it was, Alan will kill me, 3CAACU at Exeter, where they operated, or some of them operated. Picture, as I say, is a farewell fly past, and most of those aircraft were used or destroyed in films that we shall not mention that were made at that period. Some were destroyed, some ended up at museums, and I'll end, if we can move to the next slide. Excuse me. Where can you see a mosquito today? Well, there are several in museums around the UK. You've got pictures there of the one in the roof at Duxford, TA719. You've got TA639 that's at Cosford. There is HJ711 that does taxi runs at East Kirkby, which is an airframe that's a composite of two different aircraft. The de Havilland Museum that we've mentioned a couple of times has 3 mosquitoes on display, including the prototype. And there are, and this is where we're hoping to change this, there are only 4 in the world that are airworthy to our knowledge. VR796 Bob Jens in Victoria in Canada, KA, excuse me, 114, sorry about that, Jerry Yagan in Virginia Beach, TV959 Paul Allen in Washington. PZ474 was sold in 2020 by Rod Lewis to Charles Sommer. Now, those are the only airworthy ones that we are aware of. The last mosquito that was airworthy in the UK, I'm sure you know, was RR299 that sadly crashed at Barton in July 1996, where the crew was sadly killed. Now, it was that aircraft that got me interested in the Mosquito, because it was obviously based out at the Broughton factory at Airbus when I was working there, and I was shown around the hangar by one of the crew, and it's just a beautiful aeroplane. I was really quite upset when I heard that news, but what our charity wants to do is to get another Mosquito flying in UK and European skies again. So that is a very, very, very swift run through the history of the Mosquito, some interesting facts, a little bit about how it was made. And now at this stage, I'm going to hand over to Alan, who's going to talk about our charity and the project. Thank you for listening. Please do get in touch if you want to follow up on the books, or if you've got any other questions on anything I've said, and I'll be happy to try and help. Thank you, Alan, for driving.
So I'm going to spend the rest of the probably about 30 minutes talking about the Peoples Mosquito, the charity itself, and a little bit about what we're doing. So our aim is, as we've already alluded to return a mosquito to our skies, and using the principle of the presentation aircraft, things like the Black Horse Spitfire and a number of other companies during the war were involved in funding aircraft, and many of the companies that were involved in the production still exist. We want to continue that. Our strapline, as you can see there, is to fly. So obviously we will have that aircraft flying, to educate and inspire future generations and recognise the Mosquito as it is one of the finest examples of British engineering. And also remember our heritage and the thousands of people who were involved in building, maintaining and flying the Mosquito both during and after World War II. As I say, many of the companies involved in producing the aircraft during the war still exist today. And what we want to do, mainly with donations from the public, but also with some sponsorships, hopefully Heritage Lottery Fund and legacy donations, is locate, purchase, restore and return Mosquito to our UK skies. The aircraft will be, as we say there, it's a Mosquito for the UK public. It will be owned and operated by the Peoples Mosquito charity itself. So how did we start? Well, Managing Director John Lilly back in December 2011. He was back in the UK for Christmas. He was working out in China at the time, and he just was looking around, and he'd seen at that stage KA-114, which David just mentioned, was the first restored aircraft to fly. That had just completed its first flight in New Zealand. We'd seen the success that the Vulcan to the Sky Trust had had in returning XH558 to the skies. And John said, hey, why can't we do something like that with the Mosquito? And he got about 12 people interested. And those 12 people basically formed the company in 2012. And over the years intervening, that group has morphed from just a group of individuals interested in doing something to form the board and ultimately the trustees of the charity. We are using social media to promote the project as much as we can, and that of course gives us a global appeal. We've got a very strong IT presence, and that gives us hopefully unrivaled access to the project. We've set up and have run for a number of years now a website. We've got a Facebook group or Facebook page with about 20,000 followers, Twitter account with over 13,000 followers on that. We've also got accounts with Instagram and LinkedIn, a YouTube channel. The videos that we put on YouTube have been viewed over 300,000 times now. And as David mentioned earlier on, we've got a Peoples Mosquito Supporters Club, which has its own separate website and a number of forums operated there. We've got over 1,300, in fact, close to 1,400 members of that club actively participating in that right now. And also we've got an online store, which has been operating now for about 2 years. And in the past 12 months, that achieved sales in excess of £36,000. And obviously all of the proceeds from those sales, all of the profits from the sales are being put directly into the charity to help with the construction of the aircraft. Talk a little bit about our team. We've got quite a diverse board, as we've already mentioned, with a very broad range of skills, which we obviously need to have to lead the project. Our patron is Arthur Williams. I'm sure many of you will have seen his enthusiasm came across very clearly in the documentary, The Plane That Saved Britain, which he narrated, which was all about the Mosquito. John Lilly is our chairman and then managing director. John is an experienced restorer and in his day job is a project manager, so it's a natural succession for him to be the lead on this project. We've got Ross Sharp, who's our engineering and airframe compliance director. Ross actually lives in the US right now and is hopefully going to be relocating to the UK next year. He's spent a career in aviation conservation and museum curatorship and is known, certainly by us, we call him Mr. Mosquito, because if you want to know anything about the Mosquito, you only have to ask Ross and you'll get probably about half an hour lecture on that specific aspect of the aircraft. He's very, very knowledgeable. Our Director of Operations is Bill Ramsey, who some of you may well know. Bill, former RAF pilot with over 6,700 hours on some 35 different aircraft types, including both the Lancaster and the Dakota within the Battle of Britain Memorial flight. But more recently, he was the captain of XH558 and was captain of the aircraft on that last flight back in October of 2015. And Bill has already been consulting with George Stewart, who David mentioned earlier on, the Chinese nationals were flying Mosquitos. George has something like 1,000 hours of Mosquito experience, still alive and living in Canada, but after the war he was paid by or shipped out to China to teach the nationals how to fly the Mosquito and reduce the number of casualties they were getting with rookie pilots being caught by the fact that those two props rotated the same way. Also on the board is Steve Manning, who's our company secretary and our commercial director. Steve is also our IT guru and manages all of our retail arm. We actually have now a separate trading company, Wood and Wonder Trading, with its own separate board, which handles all of the merchandise that we sell. And as we've already said, both David and myself, we had our very first patron was Captain Eric Winkle Brown, who I'm sure you are all very, very familiar with. Did a lot of work at Boscombe Down over the years. I just want to share, hopefully this will work okay, a very brief clip with you of an interview that Eric did for us back in 2015 about his experiences, and the twinkle in his eye is, as he talks about the mosquito, we found very infectious.
If you look at the British aircraft industry as a whole during the war years, there were about 5 top manufacturers. De Havilland, certainly one of them. I had a very high regard for them, and the test team too. As you look through the air shows around the world, there's a certain dearth of mosquitoes. Here's one of our top airplanes, and not many around the world. Any attempt to restore, particularly to flying status, a mosquito would be a really gift to our heritage. We need something like this to remind the British public how it was and what were the tools that really saved the day for us. And when you talk about that, the mosquitoes in there, believe you me. First time I saw it, I realized it had all the looks of a potential winner. For its time, it was incredibly beautifully streamlined. It just oozed power, really. Naturally, when you have looks like a good one, you expect it'll fly similarly, but it exceeded all expectations. And was one of Britain's 3 great aircraft in World War II. We had, to my mind, 3 really greats: the Spitfire, inevitably, the Mosquito and the Lancaster. And they all had a huge part to play. Maybe the Mosquito more than most, because it was very versatile. Fighter, night fighter, bomber, did the lot. And when it was flown as a Pathfinder aircraft, it really showed its worth.
Okay, let's move on, and we'll just do a sort of fairly quick run through of how things developed after, as I said, John's the initial tweet back in 2011. So here you'll see what we know as the mortal remains of a mosquito. We acquired these in 2014. They were recovered from the crash site in Norfolk in 2010. They're actually all the remains of a night fighter 36, which is RL249, which crashed shortly after takeoff from Coltishall on the 14th of February 1949. Sadly, with the loss of the navigator. The pilot did survive. The navigator was sadly badly burned and passed away a couple of days later. Having the mortal remains of the aircraft, as it says there, it basically allows us to do a data plate restoration. Interestingly, the Mozzie never had a data plate, but the mortal remains allow us to do that with all of the required CAA approvals to do the build. So that was something we achieved in 2014. Before that, in July of 2012, we'd actually formed and registered the company as a charity. And then in September of that year, John and Ross met with the CAA at Gatwick, had about a 2-hour meeting with them, at the end of which the CAA approved our plans to go ahead and return that aircraft to the sky. In September 2013, a year later, we carried out an online poll to find out what variant of the Mosquito people wanted, and that was overwhelmingly in favour of building the aircraft as an FB6. So we started fundraising in April of 2014, and we launched our wing rib appeal, which was basically looking for £50,000 to allow us to have the wing ribs constructed. Now at that stage, all of the plan was that the construction would take place in New Zealand, where the other aircraft had been built over the last couple of years, and we had the ribs were built by Aerowood in New Zealand whilst they were building the ribs for PZ474, which was the last one that was actually completed in New Zealand. So we got an opportunity to make use of the fact that all of the tooling was set up to cut the wood and make the two at the same time, two sets of ribs, that is. So again in 2014, we attended our first air shows at Sywell and East Kirkby, and the East Kirkby ones, of course, were the ones which were known as the Three Lancs, because in 2014 it's when the Canadian Lancaster came over and flew for the summer with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Lancaster. Since that time, we've been attending air shows every year until obviously COVID intervened. And we've been building up a pool of volunteers to help us man our stand at those shows. The next significant step was in December of 2015, when we reserved the registration GFBVI with the CAA. And then in March of 2016, we registered as a charity with the Charity Commission, which was a major step for us, because once we're registered as a charity, it enables us to claim gift aid on all of the donations that are made to the charity. The next thing that happened in October 2016 was a huge boost to the project. John was still working out in China at the time, but back in the UK on vacation. And he got a call from one of the engineers at the Airbus factory at Broughton, which, as you remember, was where RR299 had been based. The guy said to John, look, we're in the process of demolishing one of the old World War II buildings, and in that building we find a filing cabinet which contains a number of microfilm drawings, and those drawings will be put in a skip tomorrow. So if you need them, if you think they're going to be of use to you for your project, you need to get here today and collect those drawings. As you can see the photograph on the screen there, there was a lot. There was 22,300 microfilm drawings, those little cards with the apertures. Total weight of the 2 bags of microfilm drawings that John took away was about 70 kilos. Fortunately, he had a big enough hire car to load those into. He took those away, and we have now digitized, stored and catalogued all of those drawings. So that was a labour of love that Ross had to go through and catalogue every one of those individual drawings. That's a significant step for us, because that meant that we had all of the original manufacturing drawings and also all of the modifications that were made to the aircraft over the years. And that allows us then to use we can manufacture any component now from those original drawings, and it means that we are able to utilise UK companies for the construction. I'll just give you on the next slide a very quick example of one of the drawings. This one I was particularly interested in. If you remember when David was talking about the history, the first flight, the demonstration to Lord Beaverbrook was in December of 1940. This drawing was made on the 26th of December 1940, Boxing Day, 3 days before that demonstration flight. And it looks, I'm surmising, but obviously there was a need for an urgent mod to be made to W4050, the prototype, before that demo flight took place. Interesting to note that there is the use of the decimal notation for the measurements. Obviously, it's an engineering drawing, so rather than 6/10, it's 0.60 of an inch. But also the other significance on this is the fact that the drawing shows quite clearly the grain, because you need to ensure that the wood is in the correct orientation to get the maximum strength out of the wood when that wood is being cut. We move on. Again, one of the most important things David mentioned earlier on, you saw the slides of the moulds. This is a picture of the moulds that Glyn Powell had made in New Zealand. And at the time when Glyn was doing his work, those were the only moulds in existence in the world. So therefore, Glyn had the ability to make, he's the only person who had the ability to make new fuselage for the aircraft. That changed in 2018 when we obtained from a museum in in Australia, the lofting drawings for the moulds, which have then allowed us to go ahead and build a set of moulds in the UK. For us, that's a major step, because being able to now manufacture the entire aircraft in the UK means that we're able to, first of all, give much greater access to the construction to our supporters. You know, if you're in the UK, then most of the support's here in the UK. We have already conducted a number of tours of the factory where the moulds are being constructed. It also means that we're able to get Heritage Lottery funding. If the aircraft was being built in New Zealand, we would not be able to get Heritage Lottery money to allow us to do the build. So again, a major step for us was the ability to have the moulds made in the UK. The other major step, again in early 2019, sadly, Aerowood, the company that we had been using, in 2018 this was, Aerowood went into liquidation. And fortunately, we were in a position, we were able to purchase from Aerowood, from the liquidators, the jigs and the tooling to make the wings, the flaps, the tailplane and the Bombay doors. And these were shipped to the UK in a container. And arrived in UK in March of 2019, and the photograph you'll see, the bottom left photograph is the container ship, the Aldana, arriving in Southampton about 11:30 at night, and I was the one sole in, well, me and my wife were the two sad individuals who were stood on the quay side and watching that ship arrive. Couple of days later, once it had cleared customs, it was then taken, the container was taken off to Retrotec, and you can see the various jigs that were inside that container. And also, of course, the ribs that we had already had made in New Zealand, they were also shipped over as part of that shipment. So that brought us up to 2019. Current status of the project then. The final completion of the fuselage moulds is now in progress, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. That's essentially the first moulds in the UK for 73 years. We launched a fundraising campaign, Operation Jericho, in spring of 2020 to generate the funds to allow us to progress the construction of the moulds. And work on those has progressed at Guy Black's company, Retrotec, down in East Sussex. Guy's company, Retrotec, has all of the necessary CAA accreditation, as an example of one of his schedules of approval shown on the slide, to allow him to carry out all of the work on the aircraft. And one thing to note is that about 40% of the project costs, we're looking at a total budget of somewhere in the region of £8 million to do this work. About 40% of that is purely to meet the CAA regulations within the UK. So it's invisible work, all of the compliance and record keeping and sample approvals that are needed. Once we've completed the moulds, as I say, they're almost complete now. We've already started work on a few of the bulkheads for the fuselage, because we needed to complete the construction of those bulkheads to determine exactly where within the moulds the cutouts need to be for those. So we have to have bulkheads constructed before we can make the final piece set of the moulds complete. but we've already started. We launched in middle of June of this year Operation Crossbow, which is the fundraising campaign now to move forward and generate the funds to build the fuselage, which will be the first fuselage to be built in the UK, obviously in more than 70 years. So as I said, current status, there's some photographs of the moulds under construction at Retrotech earlier on in this year, and they have built that where they're being constructed is a new purpose-built facility, which is still under construction. The main piece where the moulds are under construction is complete. The rest of the building is still progressing and has been worked on right through this summer, and will continue into next year with the construction of the build. By the way, the building is not being paid for by Peoples Mosquito. That's part of Guy's own investment into the project. He's building the facility himself with his own money. Progress is limited at the moment by the speed with which we can raise funds. We are clearly raising money at a reasonably good rate, but we need to raise more money obviously over the next few years to allow us to complete the construction. As well as the construction of the moulds, we've also been busy obtaining parts for the aircraft. So on this picture, you'll see we have the glycol header tank, which has been already fully refurbished by Retrotech. We've acquired one spinner. We've also acquired a control column, which we purchased from Canada, a throttle control quadrant. We've had some Siamese ports made up for the exhausts. And also we've had the cockpit control boxes. These will be where the instruments will be housed. Those are already constructed because we want to use those in the coming couple of airshow seasons as a source of fundraising activities through the summer when we are attending the air shows. So that's pretty much it. Just a plug at the end here for Retrotech, obviously, who've previously, before starting work on this project, Guy's last restoration was a DH.9 World War I bomber. So he's moved from the DH.9 to the DH.98. And as a reminder of why we want to do this, there's a couple of images from Mark Finger of one of the aircraft that's currently flying in the US. So let me just finish up, just leave that up on the screen for a while. That's our email address. If you have if you want any information from us, email info@peoplesmosquito.org.uk. Our TPM website is www.peoplesmosquito.org.uk, and Retrotech's website is www.retrotech-limited.co.uk. So that concludes the presentation.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone for listening to us, and thank you for giving us the opportunity. We do appreciate it.
Absolutely.